Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Leela Srinivasan, CEO of Parity. Leela, I am really excited to have another conversation with you. We chatted a bit when you became CEO of Parity, and we talked a lot just about women's sports at that time. But so much has happened since then, including your new research. So first of all, let me welcome you to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Great to see you again, Deb.
Yeah, and let's, before we start about, getting a little bit granular on the research, which is so fascinating, it has been an extraordinary year in women's sports. Do you want to just start with talking about that so we just create a sense of momentum?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it has been, gosh, it's been a year. I mean, I think we must have talked almost exactly a year ago, in fact. And so last summer was a huge summer of sports. There was the Women's World Cup, which made headlines for all the global records that it broke. It was the most attended tournament in the history of the event. Then later on, we saw there was a women's NCAA volleyball game that drew over 92,000 fans. That's 25,000 more people than were in attendance at the Super Bowl in 2023. And dominant display by champions Nebraska. But it was the largest crowd ever to witness a women's sporting event in history, they said at the time. And then in the summer last year as well, there was the historic US Open final right at the end of the summer where Coco Gauff beat Sabalenka, won her first major. She had 3.4 million people tuning in on ESPN, which was a million more than watched the men's final. So, many indications along the way of just how women's sports has been growing. And then if we flash forward to 2024, I mean, the year got off to a bang with the launch of the PWHL, which is the new professional hockey league. And that's had a really banner and by all accounts, very successful first season in existence. In January, the Portland Thorns, who are an NWSL soccer team, they set the new bar for valuations at a $63 million valuation. Flash forward to March, we had another record NCAA women's basketball tournament. Of course, you've got Caitlin Clark, you've got Angel Reese, but you've got all like a whole generation of stars that are really capturing viewers' imaginations. And that has now spilled in, of course, to the WNBA season, where we're just seeing an exponential surge of interest in the W, whether it's new franchises that are going to be launching in the next couple of years or record draft night. Finally, the players being able to fly charter because there was just outrage over that. And then, of course, outrage over the salary differential between the W and the NBA, or the men's, was it the WNBA and the MNBA, as people are jokingly calling it on social. And, last but not least, as a basketball fan, I'm thrilled that I can now turn on the TV most nights and see women's basketball. And that is new this year. So there's always a lot to talk about in women's sports. We know this at Parity. We're all about women's sports and sponsoring women athletes. And so I can tell you it has been fast and furious since we last spoke.
Well, I can tell by your breathlessness. I don't know how you even managed to go through all of that. But let's just run through a couple of quick things to get us going. Then I do want to turn to the research. And I know you have these statistics at your fingertips. You started mentioning women flying charter for some of their games, but just remind us a little bit of the disparity between men's and women's sports in terms of both pay and sponsorship investment.
Yes, historically, there's been a huge gap, of course, on whatever metric you consider. If we look at media coverage, the historical figure that was quoted most frequently was that women's sports had just a 4% of the total media coverage share. Last year, there was a bump that was reported thanks to streaming platforms and the fact there are more places that you can now at least view sports. So that number, even with that bump, is around 15%, 1-5. So better, but still not where it could be. Sponsorship dollars, depending on how you cut it, historically 1% or so have gone toward women's sports, and just inequity galore, depending on whether you look at players being exploited, the facilities that they have to train in, the medical support they do and don't receive. And then if we think about brands investing specifically in women's sports, the numbers that have been circulating is that on average, a mere 9% of sports media dollars are invested in women's sports. There are some brands that buck that trend. Two I would call out. would be Gamebridge, who are a sister company of ours, and also Ally Financial. Both of them are channeling over 40% of their dollars, whether in Gamebridge's case, it's on the sponsorship side, on Ally's case, it's in the media side, but they've really made a stance around women's sports. So that's exciting, but so many more brands, I think, could be stepping up. And it's, you know, the Caitlin Clark salary fiasco that exploded when people found out that over 4 years, because of the salary cap negotiations that had happened in the W, she'll earn about $340,000 over 4 years. And that's just absurd when you put it in the context of Wemby, who entered the NBA last year as the top pick with a $55 million contract.
That is a big disparity. Yes.
Need I say more? But, you know, I think everyone would agree that Caitlin Clark is a generational talent, and the money isn't flowing there yet.
Well, let's switch to the research a bit, because you're really showing that women's sports, and not that your breathlessness hasn't proven it, but you're really showing that women's sports worldwide is moving into the mainstream. This is important research, but before we get into some of the details, tell us who you surveyed.
Yes. So we partnered with online survey platform SurveyMonkey to be able to gather responses from over 14,000 adults over the age of 18 in 7 countries. It was the US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Australia. And with SurveyMonkey's help, we anonymized and aggregated the data, made sure that we followed all the usual research protocols, and that led us to be able to identify some key trends in how people are viewing, consuming, and engaging with women's sports today.
All right, so then viewing, consuming, and engaging women's sports. Why don't you start with what you consider to be some of the most important highlights?
This survey just got me so excited in terms of some of the very real proof points that we saw emerge from it in all of the countries. But if I look at the countries together in aggregate, 28% of women's sports fans are watching more women's sports this year compared with last year. And I think what was interesting when we looked at not only that momentum gain, but who's watching, men are actually the most avid consumers of women's sports. So when we isolated people who say they watch daily or weekly, 23% of men said that compared to 15% of women. So yes, you know, I suppose on average, perhaps men watch sports more frequently than women. But to me, this really silenced the assumption that women's sports are for women. We saw quite the reverse in the data. And in fact, when you look around the world, 30% of men are watching more women's sports in 2024 compared to 2023. So that was the first thing, is who's watching. It might not be who you think. And then when we step back and look at who's watching women's sports at least a few times a year, 73% of our sample said that. The same benchmark when we asked about men's sports was 81%. So only an 8 percentage point differential, which when you think about that, again, that media coverage disparity that we see, 15% compared to 85, says a lot about the fact that people are really tuning in. So that was kind of the first thing, is a lot more people are watching, and it's a lot of men are involved in that mix. The second thing I would say is we certainly heard from the global majority. They agree that women athletes are being shortchanged, and they want to see more brand investment in women athletes. It was very clear that equity has a long way to go in the markets where we surveyed. So half or more of the respondents in every country where we surveyed believe that brands are still not investing enough in women's sports compared with men's sports. And you know, aside from that, I would say Instagram emerged as the top platform for watching individual women athletes across all country. Facebook and YouTube were second and third in that mix. And then Australians were the most likely to follow women's sports accounts on social media. 42% of our folks said that, and the US was right behind at 38%. But the third bucket, I would say, and perhaps the most eye-opening stats for the brand leaders and marketing leaders in your audience, would be around the influence of these women athletes. Again, when looking across all the countries where we surveyed, 88% say that women athletes are impactful role models. And women's sports fans are 2.8 times more likely to purchase a product that's recommended by a woman athlete rather than by another type of influencer. That number goes up even further when you look at people who watch sports, women's sports weekly or more frequently, to, I believe, 3.5. In addition, 32% of all women's sports fans and 36% of female women's sports fans say that they're more likely to purchase products from a brand that supports women's sports or partners with female athletes. So when you hear these stats, to me, any and every brand needs to really be aware of the power, the potential, the popularity of women athletes, because I think there are applications, whether you're B2B or B2C, for partnering with women athletes to create engagement and resonance in the market.
Now you raise some extraordinary points, and I think some of them bear repeating, particularly the third area that you talked about influencers and the willingness that consumers have to essentially trust a woman athlete. I think that that is something that may not come to mind immediately, but you started to talk a little bit in the beginning about some elements of brand sponsorship, and I think that we have seen some strides. You did mention Ally Financial, and I know Andrea Bremer, and she's done an amazing job. We actually gave her a Grand Prix for the work that she did in terms of allocating equal dollars, or at least close to equal dollars, to men's and women's sports. But there was also news that Barbie is now partnering with women's pro hockey, which makes us think. I thought that when I saw the Angela Merkel Barbie, that I'd never see another Barbie that I would find unusual. But hey, here we go. But there's a statistic that I know that you use, which you say that Deloitte projects 300% revenue increase in women's sports by the end of 2024, and yet it still makes up less than 1% of the global sports market. So again, talk a little bit more about that, and how do you change it? What do you do? How do brands, start to think differently?
Yeah, it is. It is daunting and also a little frustrating, because on the one hand, there's all this momentum. It could not be clearer that people are leaning into women's sports, and advertisers and marketers are starting to pay more attention for sure. The truth is that the infrastructure around women's sports is still catching up, and is not, it's been far overtaken by the surge in popularity that we're seeing, for example, in the US and in women's basketball, although it's happening in other countries and other sports as well. And there are all sorts of historical reasons, I would say. I mean, women's sports have received much less funding and sponsorship compared to men's sports over time. That means less money for development, marketing, promoting women's sports, whether it's the events, whether it's the athletes. And then there's this media coverage gap that we've talked about. And it's like a vicious cycle, basically, because what happens is the athletes in the sports don't have the same level of visibility. And that in turn means fewer opportunities for revenue generation through broadcasting rights, ads, merchandising, and that sort of thing. And then the other thing to throw into the mix is that most women's leagues, if not all women's leagues, are much younger than their male counterparts that have been around for many decades longer, and who've had all that time to really build up and prosper. I mean, the PWHL, like I said, is in its first season. So, I think Deloitte's estimate, I'm hoping that's a low bar and a conservative starting point. Yes, yay, we're over $1 billion. But we're only at 1.3 billion in a tens of billions of dollars industry. And I do think that the pro teams that are launching today, whether it's in hockey, volleyball, soccer, there's a new USL Super League coming. They have to get off to the right start. They have to have a commercially viable first season and break those revenue barriers and so forth. And I do think, not to put responsibility on your audience, Deb, but I do think that brands have a huge role to play here. And I'm hoping that the research that we've done gives them confidence that now is the right time to really surge and put their best foot forward in women's sports, because people are tuning in, people are noticing which brands are investing and making a dent in this deficit, if you will. And there's just such a halo effect, a positive effect around all things women's sports. There were many other stats in our survey that I haven't quoted yet, but I'll share one around the credibility boost that brands received. So I think it was 57% say that they trust that a woman athlete believes in the product that they're promoting, compared to 50% who trust that a male athlete believes that. So there's a 7% credibility boost that you get from working with a woman athlete compared to a male athlete, which I thought was interesting. So, now is the time for brands to really be part of a better and brighter future in women's sports.
Well, let me ask a couple of other quick questions that are very much related to this. It sounds like women's soccer or football, tennis, and basketball currently receive most of the sponsorship monies. What happens to other sports?
Yeah, I think that's right. Golf is another one that
Oh,
receives
golf, yeah.
a
Sure.
lot of money, in part because I think brands are used to spending money in golf, and there are hospitality opportunities, around golfing events and so forth. So, but yes, those are the sports that get the money. Some of that was reflected in our survey in terms of the women's sports that people most commonly watch, where we saw that women's soccer and tennis are the most popular worldwide, except in the US, where basketball is dominating, I would say. Um, I think 56% of our audience said that was a sport that they tune into, compared to 25% or less in other countries. But I think, what happens in the other sports, it's, I think they're even further behind when we look at money flowing into the sports. And we see this acutely because at Parity we work with over 1,000 athletes across 80 different sports. So yes, we have major representation in the major sports, but we work with athletes in every sport from archery to weightlifting. And so we see that the athletes in some of these longer tail sports really do struggle economically because they don't make enough from the stipends and the money that's available within their sport to subsist. And so they end up having second careers and third careers in some cases. But what I will say is that the glimmer of hope that I have is in looking at some of the newer sports that are coming to the market, where if you have the chance to design sports across men's and women's from scratch, people who are entering a space for the first time are showing a lot more balance in their approach. I would highlight sports like pickleball, CrossFit, and also rugby sevens, where gender equity is really ingrained in the model from the outset. And I'll give a shout out to my friend Owen Scannell, who is the CEO and founder of Premier Rugby Sevens. They basically have a men's and a women's tournament that runs side by side. The scoring for the season is basically an aggregate of the men's and the women's scores. So the teams really basically succeed or fail together in a specific market, and the players, whether male or female, are paid the same. So when you can start from the beginning, you can create a different future for women's sports.
Or that's very interesting, very interesting. It also leads me to another question because you mentioned you surveyed 7 countries.
Mm.
I know there was a lot to digest in this, but did you notice some interesting things from different countries, or were there surprises from one country versus another?
Yes, it was really fun to be able to dissect different international quirks and approaches, if you will. And as an aside, I had some inbound communication from Germany, they really wanted to talk about the survey because apparently not a lot of research has been done in Germany on women's sports fandom. And so it was great to be able to shed some light. So I'll drop a few stats here, but I really would encourage people to read the full report because there's so much to kind of get into.
Yeah, we'll
But
link to it. Don't worry, we'll link to it. Yeah.
that's great. So first of all, Australian men are the most prolific watchers of women's sports that we could find. That's more than men or women in any country. So go Australia. The French, maybe not surprisingly, they're the most likely to know that this year's Paris Summer Olympics will give equal number of competing spots to men and to women. We found that awareness of that, by the way, was very low globally. In France, it was 25%. Globally, only 17% knew about that equity. So that was kind of an interesting takeaway. Let's see. I talked about that influencer stat. Women's sports fans 2.8%, 2.8 times rather more likely to purchase a product recommended by a woman athlete rather than by another type of influencer. The market where that was highest was Germany. German women's sports fans are almost 5 times more likely to be swayed by a woman athlete than by another type of influencer. And let's see. In Canada, we saw the biggest gender gap when we looked at some of these stats. So, by and large, across all markets, the majority said that women's sports don't get enough media coverage. In Canada, 70% of women said that, and only 55% of men. So there was a 20 percentage point gap in that stat. And then maybe the last one I'll share, in Spain, increased media coverage was cited by the highest percentage of women's sports fans. I think it was 48%. When we asked them about factors that were driving their increased viewing of women's sports. So there's a lot more in there, but
Yeah, and they were in the World Cup, weren't they? So yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that
and
might have something to do with it. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, we did hypothesize that their success in the World Cup had driven the fact that they're also, I think, the market where the largest percentage of women's sports fans had begun watching in the last 3 years or so.
And it makes sense. And it's like everything else. It's awareness, it's access, it's, and it starts to snowball, which is probably a metaphor for a lot of other winter sports. But anyway, you started to talk a little bit about the Paris Olympics, particularly as being really a watershed moment for women's sports. What are your thoughts about the upcoming games? But maybe more importantly, what do you think it means to the business of sports, or at least the future business of sports?
Yeah. Well, first, I have many fond memories growing up of watching Olympics all summer. I mean, it was really that and Wimbledon growing up in Scotland were the only times I saw women doing sports on TV. So they left an impact from an early age. As I said, Paris Summer Olympics are a milestone in that there will be equal numbers of male and female athletes who are competing, which I think is symbolically important. And my hope is that Paris really has the potential to really elevate the status and the commercial appeal of women's sports. My own personal thesis is post-pandemic, people are really leaning into live experiences. They're really enjoying, I think, the fact that sports brings out the best in humans at a time where there's a lot of darkness in the world. I think sports really is something that we can all rally around and enjoy and cheer for our teams. And in Paris, the opportunity to showcase women athletes on a global stage can attract new fans, new sponsors, new investments. It's just a lot of excitement and a lot of inspiration that comes from this. My hope is that you see new stars born, new athletes that you don't know today are going to rise up and become world famous based on their efforts in Paris. And as I said, I just think athletics and sports in general just bring out the best in humans. And so just looking forward to seeing how that inspires both sponsors, but then also future generations of athletes.
No, that well said. And the Olympics, of course, bring out a very high caliber of sponsor as well. You've also talked a little bit about how you represent 80 sports athletes from 80 sports. I mean, which is pretty amazing. So, in other words, I'm assuming, particularly with what you said about women as influencers and so on, you don't have to be a mega brand or a global brand to start being involved in this. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think that's a very important message. On the one hand, when you talk about Olympic sponsors, these are brands that are investing 8, 9 figures and are thinking, have a multi-year Olympic and Paralympic strategy. But the reality, and I think the opportunity for brands is even smaller brands with smaller budgets. I can guarantee you, we can find an athlete or a sport or something that makes sense for what you're trying to accomplish from a brand standpoint. So there's just lots to explore in women's sports. There are athletes, again, that you may not know who have very loyal followings and who have incredible stories that can be absolutely the right vehicle and the right partner for your brand and content creation and storytelling and making appearances and energizing your brand in different ways. So definitely encourage brands of all sizes to lean into this opportunity.
No, and maybe just before we close, I was just so impressed by some of the information around influencers and the significance of them generating more loyalty. Is there anything else you want to say about that? Because I think that might be an easy starting point for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, in marketing, we all know trust and authenticity are absolutely everything. So that stat that's 57% of people trust female athletes believe in products compared to 50% of men. And then this influencer multiplier effect that you see from, for women athletes compared to any other sort of influencer. I think that's really important for brands to take stock of as they think about finding the right ambassadors, finding, the athletes that will resonate with consumers and that have some really personal connection into the brand, their values, the products, the services, whatever, some aspect of that company's offering. So to me, when you combine the different signals that we saw in this research report, the fact that they're impactful role models, that there's this trust, I think we all know they've had to go through a lot. There's a lot of resilience built into the persona of the woman athlete almost. It's not surprising that we see them having, I think, a stronger impact on purchasing behavior than other types of influencer and than by male athletes. So, I just think it's a golden opportunity. And again, one that I hope every brand is thinking about.
Well, on that note, we'll make sure that we offer access to the research itself. But as a final question, so what's next? What's next for you and for Parity?
Goodness. Well, I think just doubling down as hopefully agents of change here. We've talked about the excitement of what's going on in women's sports, tempered by the reality of where we are from an investment standpoint as an industry. I will say I am really heartened and excited by the number and the variety of conversations that we're having with brands, especially in the last 3 to 6 months, as the signs continue to mount that this is not just a moment. It's not even solely a movement anymore. This is now a mainstream topic that brands really should be leaning into. And so our hope is just to convert more and more of that interest into actual investment, so that we start to be able to create a legacy where women athletes are more recognized, are receiving funds from different places, and we start to close that gender income and opportunity gap that is the thing that fuels us.
Well, I love that. From moment to movement to mainstream. You can't ask for anything more. I wish you only the best of success, and I know that your efforts and your passion have really made a difference already. So always a joy to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to more progress and more conversations.
Thank you so much, Deb. Great chatting with you as always.
The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.